The Arrow Lecture Series was set up in honor of Professor Kenneth Arrow, who I'm particularly pleased to say is here in the audience with us today. I don't have to tell this audience how important Ken has been to the economics profession. And there are lecture series bearing his name all over the world, Stanford, Columbia, other places too. This particular series, though it was set up here, not just because of Ken's contributions to the subject of economics, but because he's the founding director of the Jerusalem Summer School in Economic Theory, which takes place every summer right here. And he served in that capacity for a remarkable 18 years. So that certainly deserves recognition. Also deserving recognition is the support that has made this series possible. The Hebrew University, and most especially Bill Ginsberg. Probably some of you know that Bill was a student of Ken's years ago, and I can't think of a lovelier way to repay a debt to an old teacher as an old student by setting up a series in one's teacher's name. And so let me thank Bill on behalf of all of Ken's old students, including me. I'd also like to thank Eitan Shishinsky, who conceived of this series in the first place and set the wheels in motion to make it happen. This is now the third annual Arrow Lecture. The first two were given by Hiro Uzawa and Bengt Holmström. And this one is a particular treat for me to get to preside over, because I'm introducing someone who's not just a great economist, but a great and very close personal friend, Partha Dasgupta. Partha and I go way back, not just as friends, but as collaborators. And it's particularly fitting, I think, that I should have got him to a summer school on intertemporal economics, because our collaboration has been extremely intertemporal, by which I mean we've been very slow. Our first joint paper took 10 years to publish. Our most recent published paper was 12 years in the works. And that's not because of any problems with referees and editors. It's just because we got distracted. But there were other things we liked to do together. And we're enjoying doing things together here as well. I'm not going to give you a long list of Partha's accomplishments and honors because I don't want him to get conceited. But let me just mention his title. I think that's enough. It's Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, Knight Bachelor, Frank Ramsey Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Cambridge, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the British Academy, and I'm just about out of breath. So let me introduce Sir Partha.
Very much. It's a great pleasure, obviously. Now, Ken, I have two surprises for you. Well, one surprise and then a point of reference. So I'm going to show you for a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, a recording Oh, sorry. It'll become all clear in a minute. Now, shall we have... Yeah. I'm afraid the sound, 4 years have elapsed, the sound is not working, but you get the message. It's Professor Arrow giving a lecture here, and the lecture, this was 2008. I was honored by an invitation from Rick to come here and lecture on an occasion to was built around it. And I was scheduled, and I wrote the paper and sent it in, but then I was horizontal in a hospital bed for quite some time, so I couldn't come. And as would be fitting, it was just a great honor. Professor Arrow decided to present my paper at his own. There he is. He is ununderstandable at the best of times. Now he's fully understandable. He speaks too fast, as we all know. So I'm 4 years 10, but better late than never, and it's a great honor. Now, having introduced myself in the proper Indo-Anglican way, I'm going to move to becoming an Israeli. So I'm going to take my tie off, and exactly, and jacket. This was just to show where I'm coming from. But now I'm going to show you where I am. So the tie, which is rather... Now I'm a full Israeli. And it's a pleasure. During the last week, there was a major meeting. You've probably been reading about it in the newspapers, and Twitter, and so forth, in Rio. It was Rio plus 20. 20 years after the conference held in Rio, in which many matters surrounding Earth were discussed. Where we are heading, what are we doing to Earth, and so forth. And the Rio plus 20 was a stock-taking exercise. I'm not there because I wanted to be here more than there. But I'd contributed some material for some. This was dealings with nature and the effect on is over the past 200-300 years. And the news is, as you know from reading newspapers, we're told, rightly, that news is bad. Many of the indicators that are on display are these indicators of the health of ecosystems, for example, show enormous strain. About a month ago, the Royal Society produced a report to which I contributed, a study group called People and the Planet. And it had amongst its members, these were all fellows of the Royal Society, but the members included distinguished demographers and, of course, ecologists. And I was the one social scientist there. Now, one of the things I discovered was that many people think that throwing numbers, perhaps even trends, are enough for us to gather an understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature. We are part of nature, but at the same time, it makes sense to think of ourselves as standing slightly outside, because in some sense our decisions are made often with the thought that there is nature out there for us to make use of, resources we can take and make use of. And over and over again, as the report was being drafted, and demographic features of the world were being constructed, were being collated, ecological features of the world were being collated, I kept on suggesting that perhaps that wouldn't be enough, because we need to understand something of the processes at work. Ecologists, of course, very much concerned with ecological processes, unearthing the way ecosystems move over time, respond to shocks, and the internal interplay of the components of ecosystems, just as we in economics with social systems. Because there's a fundamental question which we, on the committee writing this report, weren't willing to ask, or were slightly resistant in asking, which is, how do we know that the processes are not self-correcting? As you know, there is, as always, these debates lead to a divergence of opinion, two poles. One group saying prices will rise if there are resource scarcity, the market will look after things. Market fundamentalism is often the expression, and it's not quite a caricature. There are gradations to it. Or certainly, if you read The Economist at the time that Lomberg's book was published in 2001, there it was absolutely quite clear that the implicit in the model of the Economist newspaper, I mean, was a self-correcting system. That price technology will respond to the growing scarcities, and things would be, there's no reason for alarm. On the other hand, there is the other group, and I sort of, as usual, I sit somewhere in the middle, which says the system is not self-correcting. We're overshooting. And that will contain most ecologists that I know. What I want to do at this lecture is to pull together some thoughts that I have had over the years, trying to identify reasons why, unless there is concerted effort in small social systems like village economies, right up to the grand scale of the international community, the system has serious problems. We are facing serious problems. And the way I want to do that is to think theoretically and look at structures of models to see where the difficulties might lie, why there is a need for collective action. And when I say collective action, I want to emphasize once again, it should be a multi-level scheme of things. Many of the errors that are taking place are happening in the rural communities of Africa, South Asia. And it's important to bear that in mind, recognizing that some of the ills that are taking place, the ecological ills, are occurring because of mismanagement at a very local level. Okay. Then, of course, as you lift yourself up from the local level to the level of the nation, and then finally to the international community, there are different scale of problems. I don't want you to think invariably in a global context. Everything I say will have a local counterpart, spatially localized counterpart. The magnitudes differ, the speeds differ. These processes we are thinking about have socio-ecological processes, run at different speeds and operate at different scales. What I want to do is to conflate them all and think in a systematic way and see where some of the key drivers may be of problems. Now, in order to do that, I thought also I wanted to relate this lecture to the summer school. There will be several people here who haven't been attending the summer school, but many of us who have. And the summer school is about intertemporal public economics, and I am thinking about intertemporal matters here. I will not obviously be able to cover the whole summer school's concerns, but part of it, particularly the parts that I've been lecturing on, and Raja Gavneri, my friend here, has been lecturing on as well. Okay? And it has to do with the particular posture that I'm going to ask you to adopt for this lecture is that of a citizen. The context is that of a citizen. We have a strong tendency, a very natural inclination as citizens to query the way the world works. We comment on matters on a daily basis when we read the newspapers, discuss matters with friends about government policy, personal policies, and so forth. Sometimes we think the world is going reasonably well, but most of the time we feel it's going to pots. And the helmet or the hat I'm going to ask us to put on is that of a citizen. That is to say, we want to look at matters from the perspective of other people too. Okay? And we are encouraged to do that because, or we are persuaded to do that, we are obsessed in doing that because we are interested in asking 5 sets of questions. What does the economy look like? Bearing in mind this economy could be operating at any level that you are currently concerned with. What has it looked like in recent years? What should our economic forecast be under business as usual? How is the economy likely to perform under alternative policies? What policies should be recommended for the economy? These are questions that occur to us every day, one way or the other, for a few minutes, sometimes longer. Questions A and B direct us to assess the performance of an economy, whereas questions D and E are prompted by our need to evaluate policy. C is the benchmark. What should our economic forecast be under business as usual, around which D and E are studied. D and E are the evaluative questions regarding prescription. What should we do? Whereas A and B are concerned with what is the situation, what is the state of affairs. And the customary indicators we use to judge any of these is our gross domestic product relative to population size. Another very popular indicator is the Human Development Index of the United Nations. You read about that, the index periodically in newspapers. And then more recently, there's reported well-being or sense of life satisfaction reports of World Values Survey, the Gallup surveys, as well as Eurobarometer, I think, produces these on a regular basis. People ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? Are you more or less satisfied with life? Not. They are increasingly influential, number 3. 3 days yet to know what to do with them, for reasons I won't really go into here, but the happiness literature, which the United Nations is taking quite seriously, is really about number 3. But we use GDP and Human Development Index among many others, but these are the prominent ones. These are our indicators, and I'll come back to them later. On the other hand, this lecture is about questions A and B. And then, because I remember I began by saying what we want to look at the underlying process at work and to ask whether the processes are self-correcting if things go awry. Are there reasons for thinking that we might be overshooting in some directions and so forth? Okay? So I'm really looking at questions A and B. I will not really talk much about D and E here. Now, the notion of sustainable development is, of course, intrinsically connected, intimately connected with questions A and B. How have we been doing? How are we likely to do over the foreseeable future? Now, the requirement that an object should be sustained over a period of time means that it should not diminish over the period. That's sort of Oxford Dictionary definition of sustainability. So the question really means that what it leads to is the question as to what it is that should be sustained. What is that object that we should be concerned with? The idea of sustainable development was made popular in the Brundtland Commission report of 1986, and it took the object of interest to be human needs. And a very frequently quoted passage, the report defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the definition suggests, and I was giving a more technical version of this talk, this first part of this talk yesterday, that we should seek to sustain something like the productive base of the economy under review. Okay? I will have quite a bit to say about in my second half of this lecture, about how we measure the productive base and why current methods of doing so are, in my judgment, hugely flawed for reasons that I'll come to. But at the moment, Something like the productive base is at the back of the mind of the Brundtland Commission report. Namely, are we passing on to our descendants, the next generation, an adequate amount of the stuff? And that stuff is all the objects, some of which are non-material, ideas, thoughts, and so forth. Enough of that stuff for them to meet their own needs relative to their population. So, naturally, as economists, we would ask ourselves, how do we think about the productive base? How should we construct the notion of a productive base? And having done that, we have to check that the notion that we arrive at is consistent with thoughts about what it is that we should be after. Is it only needs, or is it something more general, more a wider notion of well-being? So I'm going to work slightly reverse way. Before asking what it is we are after, I'll try and give some sense to the Brundtland Commission's intuitive notion of a productive base. Now that stuff that we think we ought to be passing on in adequate amounts to the next generation will include, first of all, the most familiar type of capital assets, reproducible capital. Buildings, machinery, roads, ports, and so forth. All of this. Typically, if you're woken up in the middle of the night and asked capital, you'd sort of think of machines or something. And indeed, in the early days of growth theory, that was what capital amounted to. Of course, today we are much more sensitive to these issues. We think of human capital as being another form of capital asset. It includes now education and skills, tacit knowledge, and I'll include health here. And I won't have very much to say about any of them at this point, but we feel that education and skills, the accumulation of that, adds to the productive base that we are constructing. For our purposes, with the Rio plus 20 in mind, natural capital looms large in our mind. The atmosphere, the oceans, ecosystems more generally, and of course subsoil resources. Those are parts of our productive base. We think it is. D, population. The demographic profile of the country, gender composition, age profile, and so forth, and the total numbers would, of course, be another component of the productive base of an economy. Notice that some of these capital assets, the way the Brundtland Commission passage that I quoted led us to, as a first approximation, would be that the productive base is really a means to an end. And we are going to pass on the wherewithal, if you like, for being able to flourish in the future. Flourish in the sense of meeting our needs. But some of these assets would be components of flourish, of what constitutes flourishing. And health would be a very important part of it, is a very classic example of a capital asset which is both a means and an end itself. Okay? If you're in ill health, you don't feel well. There's a definite sense in which your well-being is compromised. On the other hand, at the same time, of course, good health means you are productive. You can be productive. And that's useful for producing goods and services, other things that you care about. So I don't want you to think this is entirely a means-based picture, but for the moment I'll think about them as a means-based. Then we think of knowledge as part of our capital base. Theorems, ideas, all the if you like, the cultural material that we carry with us is part of our knowledge, and we would like to think of that as a productive base. And now, of course, these days we think of anything which is durable as being an aspect of capital or productive base. That includes institutions, the rule of law, social norms, all that stuff out there which enables us to transact with one another. That sort of thing. Sometimes we talk about cultural capital. We even talk about religious capital, and so forth. So I'm putting them all in the garb of institutions. And then there is the very passage of time, which could be seen as a contributor to the productive base. ideas might fall like manna from heaven, in which case the fact that you're weighted may mean you'll be passing some things on to the future. Now, for reasons which I will not really go into, except hint at, I'm going to break this list of 7 items into 2 parts, A, B, C, and D, and I'm going to keep knowledge, institutions, and time separate. And the reason is it becomes clearest when we think of institutions. It may seem natural to think of institutions as assets, and they are. But on the other hand, they're enabling assets. They enable, if they're malfunctioning, then the allocation of A, B, C, and D are improper, inefficient, unjust. If the institutions are good, one way of seeing that they're good is to ask whether the resources, the capital assets, are going to the places where they're most productive. So for my purposes here, I'll be thinking of A, B, C, and D as the capital assets. And all this can be made very rigorous, and it can be put to use as well for empirical purposes. And I'll be coming to that very soon in this lecture. Okay, where am I going with this? The Brundtland Commission focused on human needs, which are the austere component of human well-being. If we take our object of interest to be intergenerational well-being, that is to say, not only our current generation's well-being, but our future ones as well, then by sustainable development we should mean that intergenerational well-being should not decline over time. Remember, the idea was that the object of interest should not decline over time, and now we are trying to go to the nature of the object which we are concerned with, and it is some notion of intergenerational well-being. And I will not obviously go into any detail of how to think about intergenerational well-being here, but the interesting thing is it doesn't matter for this lecture. Whatever conception, whatever ethical conception that you wish to carry with you as a citizen, there will be a corresponding object that I will construct for you here. And the theorem, the last sentence gives you the theorem, a means of measuring the object that you want to pass to the next generation. The factors determining intergenerational well-being are the stocks of capital assets the economy has inherited from the past. We shall call the social worth of an economy's array of assets at any moment in time its wealth. And the array of assets are the first 4, okay, including population. And I'll immediately get rid of population by an economist's trick, so that we won't have to worry about valuing population, but instead thinking about assets on a per capita basis. Population will be there, but we won't have to measure its value except indirectly. Wealth is a stock in contrast to income, which is a flow. Now, we now have the following theorem, and that is, give me any notion of intergenerational well-being, whether it's based on utilitarianism, it could be that, it could be a contractual picture of intergenerational well-being, it could be based on notions of happiness, a more upbeat version of classical utilitarianism, so long, of course, it includes future people, whatever that object is. Give me any notion of intergenerational well-being, then that indicator would not decline over time if and only if, relative to its population, the economy's wealth does not decline over time. That's a theorem. And you might say there's something tricky about this, because on the one hand you're thinking of a notion of intergenerational well-being, and now you're talking about the productive base. Where's the link? Well, the link is in the prices that you use to value these assets. The worth, the social worth of these assets, the 4 types of assets that I talked about. And so the nature of our moral conviction will influence the value we impute to natural capital, manufactured capital, and so forth. So that's the theorem. But it's already telling us as to what object we should be studying when we assess the performance of economies. It should not be GDP, it should not be the Human Development Index, but it should be something like wealth. So we should be studying the wealth of nations, or the wealth of any economy we happen to care about. And the theorem is saying that if you try and estimate wealth, if you've got an indicator of index of wealth for the economy that you're studying, track its movement through time. If it's increasing relative to population, then you should feel sanguine that things aren't all right. Now, notice how this theorem works. So you have notion of a wealth. So you place a value to each of the assets that you've inherited from the past. Some of these assets, as time goes by, let's say over a 1-year period, you find that some assets have accumulated, others have decumulated. Rio plus 20 was taking place because many assets have been deteriorating. And they were concentrating rightly on a study of those assets and saying, we're in trouble. Now, this theorem is saying, of course, that if it's possible to compensate for those declines by a corresponding increase in the magnitude of the other assets, such that wealth per capita does not decline, then you're all right. Okay? So the trick is going to be to find the valuation of these assets, the values of these assets, the social worth of these assets. So wealth does not, the very fact that it's a sum of objects, the values of objects, means that some of the components could go down, others could go up, and so long as the ones which go up compensate for the ones which go down, then you're all right. But of course, the problem is, the trick lies in the fact that a lot of this work is being done by the prices that you're using to measure the worth of these assets. It does not mean, this theorem does not mean that, it does not say that these assets are substitutable for one another. It does not say that. That would be a wrong inference. It's the index is a linear one. You're adding up. But the world out there is not linear. It's hugely nonlinear. So it could be that there will be some, for a small economy, let us say a village, if its water hole starts disappearing, then that becomes a very critical asset for that economy. And no amount of additional houses is going to compensate for the decline in the water level. Okay? Now, how is that captured? It's captured by the social price of water. That's how it's captured. And the more scarce the object becomes, the price, the social worth of that object rises. And that's how this theorem, that's the intuitive reasons to why this theorem is correct, in the sense that it picks up the fact that as objects become more and more scarce, they become dominant part of the wealth. So if an ecological resource for a village is dramatically reduced, threatening the village's future, any further reduction would score a hugely large negative weight on wealth, the movement in wealth. Okay? So that's the result. Assessing sustainable development means we should measure movements in the wealth of nations. You can see why now any indicator which is not related monotonically to wealth is going to be a misleading index, if the theorem is correct. It will be a misleading index for assessing the sustainability of that economy. It turns out GDP per capita, of course, is not positively related to wealth. And that's the clue lies in the fact that it's gross domestic product. It's gross. It doesn't take into account depreciation. So if a piece of natural capital depreciates, GDP will not record that. In fact, you could have high growth rates of GDP at the expense of your natural capital. And it wouldn't be picking up the fact that you're actually living off an asset, and you're living off assets. You're driving down assets. And that's been the method by which you're increasing your income. But of course, you can't do that forever. What will happen is the crunch will come at some date. And these, in a way, this theorem, these ideas that I'm discussing with you, are at the heart of what has led to people wanting to have meetings like Rio Plus 20. Similar comments can be made to HDI. Now, this is so far theory. There have been attempts, and Professor Arrow has been much involved in it, in this research program, of trying to put some numbers to these objects of interest. certain types of natural capital, manufactured capital, putting them together and trying to estimate the wealth per capita of nations, certain nations, and seeing whether we could say something about the progress and regress of nations over the past 20, 30 years. After all, that's a very standard kind of work at the World Bank, United Nations. We are constantly assessing the way different countries have performed over the past. That's what economic history is about, and particularly recent economic history, where the numbers are there for us to work with. And there has been a deal of work at the World Bank itself, and most recently at the International Human Dimensions Program which is one of the four programs of ICSU, the International Council for Scientific Unions, centered in Paris. IHDP, the International Human Dimensions Program, has last week produced the Inclusive Wealth Report 2012, which was submitted at the Rio Plus 20 conference, where 20 countries were studied to see whether over the past 10 years their performance has been reasonable in terms of inclusive wealth. Now, the empirical work on wealth is shot through with problems. Many, many types of capital assets cannot yet be valued. Some cannot be for very obvious reasons. They're incommensurable. A place of religious location, a sanctified spot, hallowed ground. Would not wish to price it. Well, we have standard ways of thinking about those problems. We say, thus far, no farther. We create a ring, we ring fence it. And then we talk about valuing other objects. Okay? We say, this cannot be touched. And then we proceed with the others. So there will be extreme cases which will never be doable. The social price, or we economists call them shadow prices, will not be obtainable. For some extreme cases, market prices might do. They might reflect, as a reasonable approximation, the social worth of and it would be very nice if we could use market prices, because they're there, if they could be used as a first approximation, as a benchmark around which we make corrections on, and thereby try and estimate shadow prices, the social worth of these assets. Okay? Now, the flow of well-being, remember, we're looking at intergenerational well-being. And I began by saying that intergenerational well-being, no matter what your forecast of the economy is, will depend on the assets that you have inherited from the past. And the same thing will happen next year, and the year after, and so forth. And what you try to do is to track these assets, the productive base, as it moves through time. And the tracking is done by means of this indicator, wealth. So that's the idea. But of course, on a daily basis, the flow of the assets don't play a part. They are producing goods and services. We are interested in the flows of goods and services which are creating well-being. And so we need a connection between the assets and the stuff that we can produce with them. There are several, at least two ways of thinking about the determinants of well-being, the flow of well-being, how you're feeling today, how you're feeling tomorrow, and so forth. And one is an Aristotelian notion that what matters in life are relationships, activities, engagements, the purposes of life. And the other, which is the crude economist's view, is to say that the well-being depends on the consumptions of goods and services. So the two are not incompatible, because any activity, any engagement requires goods and services as a means of engaging in those objects. So as a reduced form, we could think of the flow of well-being as being a function of the flow of consumption goods. And that's, of course, the way we economists study these matters. We think well-being depends on the distribution of consumption goods, but the production of these consumption goods require capital assets, and that's the link. Scholars have the question is then, what determines our demand for goods and services? Scholars have studied the drivers or the determinants, by variously asking, 1, what is the human good? 2, what do people care about? 3, what do people say when asked how they are or how they feel, which is the question that the Eurobarometer and these world value surveys do. 4, what considerations do people take into account when choosing? 5, what do they choose? Now, it's different people ask this question about the human good through any one of these 5 routes. And it is tempting to assume that one may move seamlessly from 1 to 5, but 1 is a deep question in ethics. What is the human good? And 2 is prompted by the need to understand human desires and aspirations. What do people care about? Whereas 3 is about the responses people make to questionnaires. What do people say when asked how they are or how they feel? And 4 and 5 involve the psychology and sociology of behavior, including constraints that people face, income constraints, and so forth. And there are potential bottlenecks at each link in the chain leading from 1 to 5, as well as from 5 to 1, although much of the economics literature moves between them without a pause. And I think we do that not because we are vulgar as a profession, but because the job has to be got done. And it's all very well to talk about what is the human good. Philosophers have been doing it for centuries. And we were trying to get a handle on it by asking how well people are provided for. And then we asked many other things, of course. But as a kickoff, but of course, how well people are provided for in part are determined by what people choose. And so the theory of revealed preference, which students in this audience are very familiar with, is really an exercise in reverse engineering. It says you look at what people choose and try and infer their values. And that's not an absurd way to go about things, because at least you've got something tangible out there. And that's one reason why we economists spend an awful lot of time studying market data, responses of people have to incomes and prices, taxes, and so forth, is to tease out. I mean, the finance minister may have different motivation for wanting to know the responses. He may want to know how much revenue he can collect by raising a price of something through a tax without asking how the people feel about it, because he needs to raise some money. But for the welfare economist, the aim of the game is to see whether you can tease out from people's behavior what they care about, and if you think that if it's their notion of what they should care about, what they care about is what is their good, and no ethicist should come in between that move, then it seems plausible to think about a move from 5 to 1, which is what, of course, we do. But of course, we should recognize that there are problems at each link in this change from 5 to 1. Now, what I want to do is to study in the next 10 minutes, the remaining 10 minutes that I have, I want to discuss the way we economists study this question of inferring values from choice, and therefore trying to estimate the social worth of objects from market data, or market or non-market data. Right. The economist's favorite model of the drivers of consumption is based on the beings and doings of a solipsist. My complaint about the way we have gone about moving from 5 to 1 has been not that this exercise is futile. It's not. I don't believe it's a futile exercise, particularly if you're driven by democratic impulses, which I am. The problem, as I see it, is that we think of the consumer or the chooser as a solipsist. The solipsist well-being, item 2 on our list, at any moment in time depends solely on his or her consumption of goods and services. In a market economy, an individual's demand for goods and services, item 5 on our list, what people choose, is therefore a function solely of market prices and his income. And I began by suggesting that there are deep reasons as to why we may be overshooting, why the processes are not self-correcting. And I'm now going to proceed with that thought and see how far I can justify it. One important departure from the standard model would be to incorporate habits. In this account, the person's past selves influence their current self's demands for goods and services. That's not a big departure. If you're looking at short-run data, habits or past consumption will be parameter. It'll be a description of the household's demand. If you're using that for generating the future forecast, then you can't regard it as a parameter, because tomorrow's parameter is today's choice variable. What you consume today is going to affect your history of consumption tomorrow. And therefore, if that affects your choices tomorrow, why then you've got a history-dependent process. That has been observed. That is to say, habits have been much studied. There's no question that the data suggest, at least for consumer consumer non-durables, habits matter enormously. This has been really a main theme in the inquiries of empirical sociologists. Now, the thing about habits is that it does not necessarily lead to non-self-correcting behavior, because habits are, if you like, an intertemporal externality, to use a technical term for economic students here, which is my choice affects my preferences or my demands next period. But of course, if I'm smart and if I have enough information about the way habits are created, I would know how to track my life over time by anticipating that. So I could internalize these externalities if I think through my life. Because the point is, the effect that current consumption has on future consumption, or future demand for goods and services, rather, is that of the same person. So there is some reason for thinking that perhaps habits are not going to be the cause for our getting into trouble. But I will later on suggest that they may be. I mean, at the end, I'll suggest that we may have problem. The two features that I think the solipsist really misses, or solipsist model really misses, are two additional motivations that we have for consumption of goods and services. One is social consumption, and the other is competitive consumption. By social consumption, I don't mean public goods. I mean, they could be private goods. So let me start with the social consumption one. And for those who don't do economics on a daily basis, by externalities I mean the unintended or unrecorded consequences of actions. That's all I mean by externalities for our purposes. Okay? If they're recorded, they will be picked up by prices. Right? Social consumption. Let me begin with this. What do I mean by that? This type of social influence has its roots in people wanting to belong to their group. Individuals don't want to be different from others in their consumption of such goods. If C star I is the average level of consumption of I by a person's peer group, if P is the set of prices of goods and services and I is her income, her demand for I is D. But now, for the solipsist, it depends only on the prices and income. But here, it depends also on the average consumption of I by the peer group, C star I, where DI, P, I, C, I star is the demand. It's a social consumption good if it is the case that DI, the demand for this social consumption good, is approximately the average. You want to be like others. Now, the trick here is the fact that the average is, of course, endogenous. If everybody's looking at the average, then you have a fixed point issue argument to contend with here. Not a big deal, but intellectual deal, know how to handle it. But what it's saying is that people are looking over their shoulders and wanting to be like others. Okay? Fads and fashions are examples of social consumption. You can't really explain fads and fashion without some such notion at the back of your mind. Religious goods are other examples, as are many other goods. Though, of course, we don't know in advance which goods may play the anchoring, may prove to be the goods around which we wish to align ourselves to become part of society, as the ones this is very much a choice. I know very little about the mechanism by which this happens. And we don't want to do it for every good. We don't do it for every good. There'll be some goods for which we are solipsists. Perhaps choice of toothpaste. But perhaps not about the kind of clothes we wear. There we tend to conform. So this is the model of conformism. And the goods around which we conform are something that we can't tell in advance, and something I want to come back to in a few minutes. Students for game theory notice that this kind of social consumption, that is, conformist behavior, leads essentially to coordination games. So you would expect there to be multiple equilibria. And that could be a source of some of our problems, because we could end up consuming too much of a good because everybody else is. And then, of course, by recursion, we end up in an equilibrium in which we consume too much of it. The preliminary thought before my final thought is this. Suppose there is in the environmental literature, we think about externalities in terms of environmental goods. Carbon in the atmosphere is not taxed, and so there is an excessive emission of carbon. Or it's not priced, there's an excessive emission of carbon. Fish in the open oceans are open for exploitation. There is too much of harvesting. So the brunt of the externalities that we typically study falls on those objects out there, our dealings with nature. Where I'm trying to do now is to relate those externalities to the externalities generated by the fact that we are social animals. We are not solipsists. And the two together might lead to non-corrective behavior. So that's social consumption. The other is competitive consumption. This has been much studied recently. The idea here is that for some goods, we compete. We want to be better than the others. Now, this is very different from conformism. It says that if my neighbors have a particular type of car, I want it to have at least as good a car as that. On the consumption side or the income side, it may be that you care about the fact of your income or consumption relative to others. The original notions of this, at least in the literature that I'm familiar with, is in Veblen's work of the late 19th century, early 20th century, notion of conspicuous consumption stemming from the desire for status, for example. Say there are two goods, but there may be for other reasons here. Say there are two goods, the first of which serves as a status good, and the other starts as a standard good. A person's well-being takes the form of his or her consumption of the first good, of the second good, and the amount of first good relative to the average of the first good's consumption, relative to the average, where CI1 star is the average consumption level of good one by a peer group. So if others consume more of C1 of the first commodity, then you feel bad, ceteris paribus, you need to raise it. Students of game theory, competitive consumption, when you model it, amounts to a PD game. And you know what the problems there are. Now I want to close this with, sorry? I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't, can we have the, okay. So, may amount, yes, absolutely, quite right. This man constantly corrects me at every talk, and rightly so too. By the way, he's always right, so that's not this is not a problem. Right, of course, it may. Yeah. But what I mean is that whenever I've set down a model like that, it has the flavor of the PD game. All right. Now, well, let me round up things. If these consumption externalities, social externalities of social consumption and competitive consumptions are quantitatively significant, and if the objects around which we build our social and competitive consumption, remember they evolve over time, and presumably relative prices influence the kind of commodities around which we build our social life, And if those relative prices are distorted because of the kind of externalities that ecologists study and we environmental economists study, then we have a problem. Because it could well be that we are the consumption externalities are riding on the cheaper objects. And they are cheap, the objects are cheap, relatively speaking, because they are intensive uses of resources which are underpriced. Moreover, if they continue to remain underpriced, then of course technological change will be directed not at economizing on those goods, but on the more expensive goods. So we will have a direction of technological change. The theory would tell you very clearly that the direction of technological change will be towards resource-intensive goods so long as these resources are underpriced. So the trigger mechanism for the distortions arise to begin with, perhaps, for underpricing of ecological resources. And then many things follow from that. And one set of things that follow are the demand for goods and services arising out of, to be reinforced, if you like, by our urge to compete or our urge to be part of society. Now, the problem is I can't give you any idea of the magnitude of these effects, of these consumption effects. And the reason is that my colleagues who study consumption don't build their models along these lines. On the whole, the most recent surveys of consumption in the Journal of Economic Literature, full 47 pages of it, are built around the solipsist consumer. The problem there is the following. And you will have, those of you who are students, you will know that from advance. The directional derivatives, say, response to a price change in the demand for goods and services, the sign of the derivatives will be the same whether or not you have these externalities. If the price goes up, other things being equal, there will be smaller demand for that object. Where competitive consumption and social consumption make their mark is on the magnitude of the effect. But the econometrician is not going to study the magnitudes and say, well, have I got it right? Because all the study will be telling, the numbers will be telling them, yes, I've got the directional derivatives right. Yes, the model looks good. So unless you actually test for these effects, you won't see them. The data won't reveal them to you. Of course, you'll have an intuitive notion of it. Sociologists will be telling you about it. Moral will be telling you about it. But we will not be numbers. Unfortunately, I can't give you the numbers. And I think it's something that probably ought to be now on the agenda of consumer demand theory. I shall end now. I wanted to suggest that we do need to respond to Rio Plus 20 and such international occasions as economists, but we need to suggest that what we really need to do is to understand processes, to see where the distortions are and what kind of correcting measures are required. They will require collective measures, no doubt, at various levels, but corrective measures of what amount? And at this point, we don't really have much of a sense. Certainly not in terms of the externalities in consumption that I've given some weight to the second half of my lecture. There is a good deal of work on the externalities on our resource use. That is what environmental and resource economics is all about. But there are some additional problems which may be very important. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take questions or comments.
We have time for questions, and Partha, why don't you take them?
Yeah, please, yeah.
With regards to the wealth, the concept of wealth,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a nice idea that you can compare intertemporally. For example, the example of the water, when you have a scarcity of water, then it's going to be a more scarce and more viable. Even in the case that you were able to measure it, I don't see how would you do it, not how you can compare with other nations, a cross-section. Even if, I mean, you're going to be able to compare from one period to the next one, but you're not going to be able to compare from other nations, right?
That's a good point, of course, because values differ if nothing else. That's quite true. And that is why I was particularly interested in the intertemporal side of things as opposed to the cross, often what we ask, this country is much richer than that. But there, of course, we were making similar, that's also subject to criticism that you've just now leveled. When somebody says that, look, Norway is doing so much better, is now currently so much better off, whatever that means, to Nigeria. I don't think there's any ambiguity in that in my mind, but nevertheless, it does say something about it. And of course, people do respond in the way you're saying, because sometimes, look, our culture differs. So don't dismiss us just because we are poor. We have. But the points I was raising here, of course, affect the prices, the social prices. And we may be getting that very badly wrong. And I began by saying that there's a lot of imperfection in these estimates. But now I'm sort of adding to the reasons as to why we should be very suspicious of them. Yes?
I have also the question related to this concept of wealth. So the stories that you were telling about the wealth as a measure of sustainable development, it looks very, very similar to the story of the value of a company as a measure of its long-term success and the key variable profit or earnings or whatever. So in this case of the firm, we can just look how its shares are sold and check if everything is okay or not. So can we, of course, we don't trade states, but we have some government bonds or whatever. So can we look at the dynamics of their rates as a measure of these wealth accumulation in terms?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. I don't know of surrogates, reliable surrogates but my guess is we're going to be in trouble because we know the value, the real worth of a firm very often differs from its market value. In the last 4 years, what have we been seeing? No, I understand. I understand what you're getting at. Yes, but I can't give you a obvious market which we could look at. I don't know. That's a very good question, though. Thanks for asking. Sure, John.
One is when you try to evaluate the sustainable growth, you said you combine physical capital, knowledge, and so forth. I think you cannot incorporate things which we don't know about. 100 years ago, we didn't know the atom.
Yeah.
We didn't know so many things of our life. How can you include things which are unknown?
Yeah.
Are there, nevertheless?
Right.
That's one thing. The second is when you said you try to infer values from choices, it assumes that people make the right choices for their own sake. And that's maybe right in many cases.
But maybe very wrong in many other cases, as your own work shows so well. Yes. Absolutely right. I think the second one, we won't have any difficulty in agreeing because I was suggesting in any case that moving from 5 to 1 through the seek chain has a bottleneck at every stage. And you're pointing to a very good one. But what I was doing was to use what people are actually doing, economists are actually doing, and suggesting we have some problem. You come to the problems that you're mentioning. Not necessarily before, but certainly simultaneously. About unthought of possibilities, that is a problem which we sometimes talk about it, but it's hard to know what to do with it. These are not about low probability events that are taking place. That's not a difficulty. What Professor Szaszynski is alluding to is the fact that we are entering into the state space which we didn't think was there. And for that, I'm not sure I know any other way than to think about the situation as being you work with, let's say, something like expected value of intergenerational welfare based on your subjective preference of the citizen on the state space that he can describe. He may or she may or may not say there is another black box out there. I don't even know what is in the black box. That's the point of your question. But should I get in there? It might be nice. Things might be bad. The news may be very bad. The news may be very good, depending on what it is I've discovered. But then in any case, we will now have to recompute everything once we are there. It will be like a big shock, and then you re-estimate your shadow prices. I don't see any other way than, but there are people here in the audience who have given thought to it, to the same question. These are unthought of possibilities. You enter the black box. You may even know that there is a black box out there because past evidence suggests that there are black boxes that you enter into. But you don't, of course, by definition, you don't know what's in there.
Black swans.
Black swans, right. But I think that's the only way to think about it, is to say, put aside maybe, and then but it's a good question, because your perception of what might be there, your terrors, the things that keep you awake at night, may lead you to take certain actions now in preparations for the possibility of entering the black box without you justifying it. If somebody says, why are you doing it? Say, don't ask me, it's just that at 2 o'clock in the morning I sometimes wake up, and that's bad news. Okay, but that's the best you can do. But once you're there, then you have to recompute, because a universe opens up, which you didn't know of before, and relative shadow prices change.
You have in mind atomic power. So
That's right. That's right.
That's right. Brought a lot
Yeah.
of good.
Yeah.
Also, the possibility of
That's right. That's right.
What about well-being? What is the outside? The outside.
Yeah. Yes.
Two points. First is a nitpicking point, I think. At one point you were defining sustainable development, and then you said it's not to diminish the resources for society. But I would imagine that's more of a sustainable equilibrium that's not growing, you're just preventing diminishing. That's, I think, the question of if you want things to become greater or something else, just need to keep where they are. But that might not be a big point thing. The other factor is, I thought another way you can think about this sort of habit-forming consumption that you talk about is that you can also use that as a way of explaining the undervaluation of resources, because if resources are priced in a way that as they diminish in time, their value goes up, that might be undervaluing the resources if there is a momentum to consumption.
Yeah.
And so once you get to the point where it's almost over and you can't put on the brakes, the value should be a lot higher. Don't you think that?
Yeah, these overshooting can take place because of undervaluation to begin with, that's for sure. Yeah. You could be accelerating the demand for the object because of the habit-formingness, but you directed your consumption towards cheaper goods, which now become habit-forming. One can tell a story, a narrative, whereby you drift in a direction where, we use expressions like we're intoxicated with oil, or there's some expressions like that. This is just a way of explaining how that can be made. Addicted to oil, that's right, addicted to oil. That's the, yeah. So it could be, the suggestion is, I'm trying to put together the externalities that occur at the natural level, at our dealings with nature, with the externalities at the consumption level, and seeing that they have a positive feedback, which is where I came from to begin with when I was suggesting that the Royal Society, when we were writing our report, it was important for us to address the question whether we should be sanguine that the system is self-correcting. And it's not. Yes, sir.
I'm reminded of 40 years ago, this Club of Rome report.
The
Club of Rome report.
Right, right.
Which is the same flavor. I'm reminded also of Bob Solo's article about the economy will take care of it. And I asked myself, if it took care of it, it was partly prices, partly things that couldn't have been foreseen before, various other technologies, kind of thing. Why, 40 years from now, would it be again the same? Why can't I project the last 40 years to the next one?
I think you're asking very, very good question. I will not be able to do justice to it, I think. The Club of Rome was deeply flawed. It was deeply flawed because there were no price responses. It was literally. Now, I'm thinking of a world in which there are prices. Question is, are the responses adequate given the nature of are imperfections in the market system, or the political system. Similarly, I shouldn't think in terms of markets only, but the political system. And when I look at externalities, that's the whole point of looking at studying externalities, is to say there are institutional failures on the one hand, and on the other hand, as social animals, there will be a natural tendency for externalities to arise, which we may be in error for neglecting. It's not a question of being good or bad. It's that that's how we are. We do wish to be like others. We want to join. And yet we also, in some directions, we want to compete. Do they have any impact on the structure of prices and the way we use up resources? And that's all I'm doing here. And the question is also whether there's a bias towards excessive use rather than underuse. After all, the bias could have been the other way. And the arguments I'm putting together suggest to me that the bias is towards overuse of certain types of goods and services. There will be a pressure on them. Now, I think another reason why the Club of Rome got some things deeply wrong, but of course they didn't emphasize climate change, by the way, and that has become very important. They were thinking of tin and minerals and so forth, which seemed to be, in some sense, the wrong end of the stick, because it's the ecosystems which are problems, because they're living, breathing objects out there. And we have now our colleagues in the ecology departments are educating us into trying to understand how these systems operate. And they're highly nonlinear. So it could be that for a while things are going all right, but then comes a crash. We see that even in our garden pond, actually. My wife and I had a pond, which now we have covered because we have grandchildren. But the pond was not very big. It was 6 feet by 4. And we used to try and keep it clean in the sense of clear water. You dredge it and so forth. And in the summer, in the morning you wake up, you go there, it's clear water. By midday, it's flipped. You can't see the bottom, although it's only 2 feet deep. And what happens is that it's a very nonlinear process in which, by which these organisms grow, temperature, moisture, and the nutrients in there. So we do know, even from our personal experiences, then you move to a larger scale of forests, grasslands, tipping over into not grasslands, but shrublands, and so forth. We've seen those in operation. We have read about them. So that causes some difficulties. These nonlinearities, and of course in climate change now, one of the biggest news is about the nonlinearities, the potential tipping points, and the ones which may have even crossed without our knowing. If we take those into account, then we have a story in which we could say that for a while things may be all right. The errors were not going to lead to much destruction, because there is a rejuvenating tendency of ecosystems, and we could ride that through. But there may be unknown points at which the systems in different guises collapse or transform themselves. Now, transformation is not necessarily bad. It's really the extent to which the society in question, whether it's a village or the nation, can adjust to the transformation. And one of the reasons why people who work on climate, like Roger here, are worried about it is the time scale as to whether the infrastructure that we have created on the basis of supposing that climate is not a major problem may be too fixed and irreversible, at least over the period required for adjustment. And that scenario can be, that image can be used even at the smallest level, at the level of a village. I always think in terms of villages because those are the economies I like to study, because they're more easy to think of. Doesn't mean that they're not complex, but they're. So my guess is in 40 years' time we'll still be here. Some countries will do better than others and so forth. But there will be a lot of losses along the way. One reason when those countries, in this part of the world and then in these, is that we have grown accustomed to the fact that when there is a resource scarcity, something that we demand or we would like to have, and it runs out in source A, we move to source B, or we move to source C. So we want certain goods, timber, let us say, for our building purposes, and the forests of one country are deplete, well, there's another country we can go to. So we can think of substitution and say, well, the world models of the ones they were mentioning are wrong because there's a lot of substitution possibilities which they were being denied in these world models. But now, that's fine. Suppose you're in a village and your water hole starts drying up. Now you have a problem. Where is the substitution? The roads aren't there. This is in Africa, let's say. Migration is a possibility, but then you get killed by the other villages when you try and they're very poor and they have scarce resources. So I think substitution possibilities are always there to be thought about. But looking at the microcosm, the small-scale worlds, I think tell us something about the limits of substitutability, that there is a sense in which our demands need to be within the limits of, roughly speaking, something that's available. And you can play around through trade and so forth, obviously, to a large extent. But, again, to a finite extent. Bob.
Well, this is the Arrow lecture, and Arrow is an economist, so naturally this is based on economic considerations. And in economics, we talk about the preferences and the utilities of human beings.
Yeah.
But there's something that misses, and that is the world outside of human beings.
Yeah.
And necessarily, this economic analysis can't take that into account, but something should take it into account. Now, we are destroying our world. Yes, we're destroying our biological world. More than 2,000 living species are destroyed every year.
Yeah.
Yes. Who cares? Yes, maybe human beings don't care on the whole. Maybe you care, I care, Harold cares, yes. But on the whole, if you do this kind of view of C1 and C2 and so on, it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
In a broader sense, the word sustainability, we are actually destroying our world.
Well, what can I say? I'm so much with you on this. On the other hand, I need to show you that the spirit of what I'm doing is not at all orthogonal to what you've just now suggested, and something that I share very much, by saying that there will be some objects out there which should not be valued, in the sense that they should be given, they should be fenced around. I used places of holy places, if you like, as my metaphor. And,
Yes, it's a kind of holy
but it is, what you're saying is that. And yes, I think that is how we should be thinking. We should be putting a value to them, saying that thus far, no farther, for those objects. Because but then if there is a strain, I don't know how one enacts these things, because some of these are going to have to take place at the national level. People will demand, and they'll say, well, it's all very well for Robert Aumann or Partha Dasgupta to care about them, but but the intellectual framework that I'm presenting here is consistent with ring fencing species, for example.
Well, I think maybe there are sufficiently many Dasguptas and Aumanns out there who might be willing to pay in some sense, to provide incentives in some sense.
Yeah. Ken. Ken, can you, Bob, can you pass the, or I could share my.
Just sort of a brief comment. The analysis, the sort of sometimes thought is very cold-blooded utilitarian analysis. The very father of utilitarianism, who is, and also regarded as one of the acmes of cold-blooded thinking, Jeremy Bentham, was insistent that the utilities of animals, he didn't go as far as plants, as far as I know, but animals should be considered along with those of human beings. And it's interesting that when the bison was suddenly, which had been extremely numerous in the United States, suddenly became apparent that it was disappearing. There was something like where there had been herds of millions of them, there were now 4,000 or so. There was a big suddenly revulsion in the American community, and tremendous efforts to sustain and retain the species. So this feeling is, well, it's not pushed as much as we like, is not entirely absent even in the past. And similarly, the attitude toward whales.
One of the sad things is, of course, that we tend to think about the large objects which we can see. And I think Bob had implicit in his remarks, at least I was reading into it, the thought that there are these unprotected species which are out there on the canopies, tiny beetles and so forth. And they can't be ignored, or they shouldn't be ignored.
That's kind of the question. There was a question raised about these are comparisons in time.
Yes.
The question was raised about international comparisons.
Yeah.
But isn't there a similar process? Namely, we do make international comparisons.
Yes.
And there's a logic, and it's not just done, but there's very elaborate theories of that. We do it within a country. We talk about inequality. We talk about things. And part of the way is to think of a series of countries, let's say between this one and that one, which are similar enough to where you can make a path.
Right.
Quite analogous to the
That's right.
treatment over
That's
time.
right. So, thank you for reminding me that we should, instead of suppose you have large numbers of countries. I think that's what Professor Arrow was hinting at. Imagine there's a continuum of countries. That's the easy. And then they'll be parametrized by some parameter, and you could ask the same question regarding whether, as you move from small shifts in parameters, where their wealth is.
The price path.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Then, of course, you do the discrete state. I think the source of the question was values differ across countries. So I think there's something. That's it.
Well, I wish this discussion were sustainable, but time, unfortunately, is a limited resource, and we are out of it. So let us thank Partha one more time.